My name is William. I'm 26, openly gay, and I've learned, sometimes the hard way, that confidence is a language people understand faster than honesty. I don't hide who I am. I walk into rooms knowing exactly how I look, how I speak, how long I should hold eye contact before it starts to mean something. I'm not arrogant. I'm aware. There's a difference. I move cities often. New jobs, new streets, new rooms with unfamiliar locks. And every time I look for a place to rent, the same pattern repeats itself so consistently that I've stopped pretending it's accidental. I never argue about rent. I don't bargain. I don't complain about prices. I don't act desperate. Instead, I listen. Landlords expect tenants to plead, to negotiate numbers, to point out cracked walls and broken taps. I do none of that. I ask about them, how long they've owned the place, whether they live nearby, what kind of people they prefer renting to. I let them talk. I let them feel interesting again. It always starts innocently. A smile held a second longer than necessary. A laugh at a joke that wasn't that funny. I stand a little closer, not close enough to touch, just close enough to be noticed. I meet their eyes when they speak, really meet them like what they're saying matters more than the room itself. And it does. Because rooms are easy. People aren't. Somewhere between the kitchen tour and the discussion about utilities, something shifts. They relax. They straighten their shoulders. They start explaining themselves instead of the house. They want to impress me, not as a tenant, but as a person. That's when the rent drops. Sometimes it's subtle. I can knock a little off if you move in this week. Sometimes it's dramatic. Honestly, I'd rather have you here than leave it empty. I always act surprised. Grateful, like I didn't expect it, like I didn't see it coming from the moment they opened the door. The truth is, I always do. I tell myself it's practical. Living is expensive. Why not use what I have? Charm is a currency like any other. If the world insists on pricing everything, I'll simply pay in a different way. That's the story I tell myself anyway. What I don't say out loud, what I rarely admit even in my own head, is that lowering the rent isn't the real reward. The real reward is the moment they look at me differently. The moment they feel chosen, desired, seen. I've learned that loneliness makes people generous, especially men who are used to being strong, settled, invisible in their own routines. I don't force anything. I never cross lines without permission. I simply open a door and wait to see who walks through. And most of them do. For a while, it made me feel powerful. Like I had cracked some secret code. Like I was smarter than the system, smarter than the people inside it. I could step into a stranger's life, rearrange the furniture of their emotions, and walk away with cheaper rent and no consequences. That's what I told myself. But power gets quiet when you're alone at night. There are moments, lying on unfamiliar beds, staring at ceilings that don't belong to me, when the silence gets too loud. When I realize that I'm good at making people want me, but terrible at letting them actually have me. Control is safer than closeness. Charm is easier than truth. I move before anyone can ask for more than I'm ready to give. I leave just as feelings start to deepen, just as expectations form. New room, new landlord, same routine. Keeps things simple, predictable. At least that's what I believed. I didn't know then that some habits don't just work. They wait. They wait for the one person who won't play along the way you expect. The one person who sees through the charm and still steps closer. And that's how I met Jack. The house was quieter than most. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived. No background television noise, no half-open doors, no rushed energy. Just a solid, lived-in calm. The kind of place that didn't need to prove anything. Jack opened the door himself. He was 37, though he didn't look like a man trying to fight time. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that comes from routine rather than obsession. His posture was relaxed, grounded, like someone who knew where he belonged. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, forearms marked by the kind of strength that comes from doing things with your hands. Not flashy, not rehearsed, and most importantly, he didn't stare. Almost every landlord does. Even the ones who try to hide it. A quick glance that lingers too long. Eyes that travel and then snap back, embarrassed or bold. Jack didn't do that. He met my eyes, nodded once, and stepped aside to let me in, like my presence wasn't a surprise. "William, right?" he said. His voice was steady. No hesitation. No extra warmth layered on for effect. "Yes," I replied, automatically adjusting my tone, ready to slide into the familiar rhythm. But the rhythm didn't start. He walked ahead of me, explaining the layout of the house without checking to see if I was impressed. Living room, bare room, kitchen, practical details, square footage, rules. He spoke like someone who had nothing to sell except honesty. I waited for the moment, the pause where he'd ask about me instead of the room. The sideways comment. The subtle shift that always came. Didn't. Instead, he asked what I did for work. Where I was moving from. Simple questions, evenly spaced, without urgency. When I answered, he listened without leaning in, without that flicker of interest I'd learned to expect. That should have made me relax. Instead, it unsettled me. I noticed the wedding ring when we reached the spare room. Plain. Worn. The kind of ring that had been on his hand long enough to forget it was there. Married. Of course he was. The house suddenly made sense. The stability, the quiet, the feeling of something already complete. Good, I told myself. Safe. Untouchable. I leaned casually against the doorframe, tested my usual charm. A smile. A light joke about moving too often. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shift. It never came. He smiled back, politely, but his eyes didn't change. There was no hunger there. No curiosity sharpened into interest. Just calm attention. That was new. Most men, even married ones, carry small fractures. A need to be noticed. A desire to feel special again. I'd learned to find those cracks without trying. Jack felt sealed. Whole. Like he wasn't missing anything I could offer. And somehow, that made me want his attention more than anyone else's. As he spoke, I found myself listening in a way I usually didn't. Really listening. Not planning my next line, not measuring my effect. Just hearing him. There was confidence in him, but not the loud kind. It was the confidence of a man who had chosen his life and stood by it. When we sat down to talk numbers, I realized something else. I was nervous. My leg bounced slightly before I forced it still. My smile felt tighter than usual, more practiced. I hated that. I'd walked into 100 rooms like this before, always certain I'd leave with the upper hand. But Jack didn't need me, and that stripped me of my usual leverage. He stated the rent plainly. No apology. No justification. Just a number. Fair one. I opened my mouth to respond and hesitated. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure which version of myself to use. He watched me then, not in desire but in assessment. Like he was the one deciding whether I fit into his space. The power dynamic shifted so quietly I almost missed it. That was when I understood why he felt dangerous. Not because he might want me, but because he might not. And somehow I wanted to change that without knowing why. I left the house with the same rent he'd quoted, no reduction, no special treatment. As I walked away, a strange heat settled in my chest. It wasn't victory. It wasn't disappointment. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty, for someone like me, was the most unfamiliar feeling of all. I was halfway through answering one of Jack's questions when I felt it. That shift in the air you only notice when someone else enters a room. Not footsteps, not sound, presence. She stood at the end of the hallway. Jack's wife. She didn't interrupt. She didn't smile too quickly or pretend not to look. She leaned lightly against the wall, arms crossed, studying us with an expression that had nothing to do with politeness. Her eyes moved from me to Jack and back again, slow and deliberate, like she was reading a sentence between us that hadn't been spoken yet. Jack introduced her simply, using her name like a fact, not an explanation. He didn't change his posture, didn't step away from me, didn't overcompensate. That, more than anything, caught her attention. I'd seen this look before, just not usually on women. It was the look of someone who trusted their instincts more than appearances. Someone who noticed patterns others dismissed as coincidence. Her gaze lingered on the way Jack listened when I spoke. Not the words, the listening. The slight tilt of his head. The way his attention didn't wander. The way his focus stayed anchored on me even when she was right there. Nothing inappropriate was happening. And yet, everything was. She asked a casual question about how long I planned to stay in the city. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp, searching for something I hadn't revealed yet. I answered easily, too easily, aware that she was measuring me in a way Jack hadn't. She smiled then, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nice to meet you," she said, and I believed she meant the words and not the feeling. A moment later, she disappeared back down the hall, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Jack cleared his throat and returned to talking about the house. But something had shifted. I noticed it in him first. His voice was the same, but there was tension beneath it now, like a string pulled just a little too tight. He spoke more carefully, choosing his words with a precision that hadn't been there earlier. Not guilt, awareness. I told myself it didn't matter. Married men were off-limits. That was one rule I'd always claimed to have, even if I didn't examine it too closely. I didn't break homes. I didn't chase complications. I took what was offered, and I left before anyone could ask for permanence. That's what I told myself. But the truth was, I'd already crossed the line in my head. Not physically. Not even emotionally, at least not in the obvious way. But I'd noticed something in Jack that I couldn't unsee now. It wasn't desire. It wasn't even attraction in the way people usually mean it. It was hunger. Not the loud, reckless kind. The quiet kind. The kind that grows in people who've done everything right and still feel unseen. The kind that doesn't announce itself until someone finally looks at them the right way. I hadn't flirted with him. I hadn't touched him. I hadn't said anything suggestive. And yet, he listened to me like my voice reached a place nothing else did. That scared me, because men like that don't fall easily. But when they do, they fall deeply. I caught myself wondering what his life looked like when no one was watching. Whether he felt chosen. Whether anyone asked him questions without needing something in return. Whether the calm I'd noticed earlier was peace or resignation. I told myself I wouldn't be the reason things broke. I told myself I'd rent the room, keep my distance, move on like I always did. I told myself I was in control. And even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I could get from him. I was thinking about what he was missing. And that was the moment I realized something dangerous had already begun. Long before either of us dared to name it. The bike broke down just after midnight. I remember the exact sound. The dry, defeated cough of the engine before it went silent beneath me. One moment I was riding through an empty stretch of road, streetlights spaced like patient witnesses. The next I was standing there, helmet in my hand, staring at a machine that had decided it was done for the night. I checked the fuel. Fine. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The air was cool, heavy with that late-night stillness that makes everything feel closer than it is. No cars. No voices. Just me and the soft hum of electricity from the streetlights. I pulled out my phone. There were obvious choices. A mechanic. A tow service. Even a friend, though those were in short supply these days. Instead, my thumb hovered over Jack's name. I told myself it was practical. He lived nearby. He knew bikes. He'd mentioned it casually once. Like it wasn't worth noting. I told myself I wasn't doing that thing. Wasn't manipulating the situation, wasn't creating an excuse. I lied. I sent a short message. Bike broke down. Sorry to bother you so late. Any chance you could help? The reply came almost instantly. Where are you? No hesitation. No question about the time. No inconvenience layered into the words. I sent my location. Stay there, he wrote. I'm on my way. I hadn't even put the phone back in my pocket before the familiar knot tightened in my chest. The one that always came when things started going exactly as planned. And yet, this time it felt different. He hadn't asked why I didn't call someone else. He hadn't suggested alternatives. He just came. His car pulled up less than 15 minutes later, headlights cutting through the dark like a decision already made. He stepped out wearing jeans and a jacket thrown on hastily, hair slightly rumpled, like he'd left in a hurry. Hey, he said softly, as if raising his voice might disturb the night. Relief washed over me. Quick, sharp, and unsettling. He crouched by the bike immediately, hands confident as he inspected it. I stood nearby, helmet tucked under my arm, watching the way his brow furrowed with concentration. He didn't complain, didn't joke about the inconvenience. He treated the situation like it mattered because I did. "It's not serious," he said finally, "but it's not riding anywhere tonight." "I figured," I replied. He straightened up and looked at me, then really looked at me like he was checking for something beyond the obvious. "You okay?" The question caught me off guard. No one ever asked that first. "Yeah," I said, a beat too late. "Just annoyed." He nodded and stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture. Friendly, grounding, electric. I felt it immediately, the way my body responded before my mind could catch up. His hand was warm through the fabric of my jacket, steady, reassuring. He didn't pull away, didn't squeeze, just stayed there like it belonged. "You can leave the bike here," he said. "We'll sort it out tomorrow. I'll give you a ride." I met his eyes. The streetlight caught his face in soft shadow, carving depth into features I'd already memorized more than I wanted to admit. The quiet between us stretched. Not awkward, not rushed. Charged. "Thanks," I said quietly. We stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand still on my shoulder, my breath slower than it should have been, neither of us moving. He was the first to step back, but only slightly. On the drive, the silence returned, but it felt different now, heavy with things unsaid. The radio stayed off. The city slipped past the windows, distant and irrelevant. When we reached my place, he cut the engine but didn't immediately get out. I turned toward him, about to say something casual, something that would keep things safe and contained. He spoke first. "I'm glad you called me." Not "it's fine." Not "anytime." Glad. I swallowed. I didn't know who else to call. That was true. He nodded, eyes searching my face like he was committing it to memory. Then, without thinking, or maybe after thinking far too much, I leaned forward and hugged him. I meant it to be brief. It wasn't. His arms came around me slowly, deliberately, like he was asking a question with his body instead of his voice. I could have stepped away. I should have. I didn't. The hug lingered. Too long to be accidental. Long enough for me to feel his breath steady against my shoulder. Long enough for him to feel the tension in my body, the way I hadn't fully relaxed into it. Neither of us said anything. When we finally pulled apart, the space between us felt louder than the silence had before. His hands stayed at my sides for a second longer than necessary. My fingers curled slightly into the fabric of his jacket before I forced myself to let go. "Get some rest," he said, voice lower now. "Text me when you're inside." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I walked toward my door, I felt his eyes on my back. Not possessive, not hungry. Protective. Certain. Inside, I leaned against the door and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was the moment it hit me. I hadn't orchestrated anything. I hadn't nudged or hinted or maneuvered. I'd planned to use him the way I always did, slowly, subtly, on my terms. But tonight, without flirting, without touching, without a single suggestive word, he'd chosen me first. And that scared me more than any broken bike ever could. I didn't expect to see him again that night. I texted him like he asked. Inside. Thanks again. And I assumed that would be the end of it. A clean pause. Space to breathe. Time for the tension to settle back into something manageable. Instead, my phone buzzed a few minutes later. "I'm still awake," Jack wrote. "Mind if I come up for a bit? Just to talk. Just to talk." Those 3 words should have been harmless. Safe. They weren't. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, fully aware of what I was inviting in, and what I was pretending not to. Then I typed back, "Sure." When he arrived, he didn't bring urgency with him. No rush, no hunger in his eyes. Just that same steady presence, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. He took off his jacket, sat on the edge of the couch, and waited for me to settle first. We talked about nothing at first. Work, music, cities we'd lived in, stories that didn't carry weight but created rhythm. Laughter came easily, quiet, genuine, the kind that fills space without demanding it. At some point, we stopped sitting across from each other and ended up side by side. Not touching, just close enough. Our knees brushed once, twice. Neither of us acknowledged it. I noticed the way he shifted slightly, not away, but into the space between us. I noticed how carefully he chose his words now, like he was balancing honesty against restraint. The night deepened around us. The city outside grew quieter. Inside, the air felt thick, charged with things we both felt but refused to name. "You do this often?" he asked suddenly. "What?" I said, though I knew what he meant. "Move around. New places. New starts." I shrugged. "It keeps things simple." He studied me then, really studied me like he was looking past the answer. "Does it?" The question landed heavier than it should have. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I leaned back into the couch, letting my shoulder brush his arm. This time it was intentional. He didn't move. We talked until our voices softened and our sentences trailed off. At some point, the conversation thinned into silence that didn't feel awkward, just full. When the hour grew too late to pretend this was casual, neither of us suggested he leave. He stretched out on one end of the couch. I lay back on the other, close enough that the warmth of his body felt like a quiet promise. The lamp stayed on, casting soft shadows across the room. We stared at the ceiling, breathing in the same rhythm. "I should go," he said eventually. He didn't move. "Yeah," I agreed. I didn't move either. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt irrelevant. Then he spoke again, voice low, careful. "I need to tell you something." I turned my head toward him. "Okay. I've been fighting this," he said. "Not tonight. Not since your bike broke down." My heart stuttered. "For weeks," he continued. "From the first day you came to see the room. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just curiosity, that I was imagining it." He exhaled slowly. "I wasn't. I didn't touch him, didn't reach for his hand. I just listened. I don't know what this is," he said, "and I don't want to disrespect anyone, but pretending I don't feel it has been exhausting." Silence followed, thick and honest. "I didn't plan for this," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm telling you now, before it becomes something we can't step back from." But even as he said it, we both knew we already had. Sometime later, sleep found us. Not separately, not together, but suspended in between. My head rested closer to his shoulder than I remembered choosing. His arm lay along the back of the couch, not touching me, but there, present. Nothing happened, and yet everything had. Because when morning came, I knew one undeniable truth. Whatever line we hadn't crossed with our bodies, we had already crossed with our hearts. What followed didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, disguising itself as routine. Coffee in the mornings became our excuse. Just a quick cup before work. 10 minutes that somehow stretched into 30. We talked about ordinary things, traffic, deadlines, things that didn't matter, while carefully avoiding the one thing that did. Late nights followed. Texts that started harmless and ended with long pauses where neither of us wanted to be the first to say goodnight. I learned the patterns of his days. He learned mine. We became familiar in a way that felt intimate without ever being declared. It was all happening in secret, not because we planned it that way, but because secrecy was the only shape it could take. His life existed in careful compartments. Mine had always been temporary. Somewhere between those two truths, we created a space that belonged only to us. The longing crept in slowly, in the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, in the way my chest tightened when he had to leave, in the way silence between messages felt heavier than words ever could. When intimacy finally happened, it didn't feel like a decision. Felt like surrender. There was no rush, no urgency, no hunger to take, just a quiet, overwhelming need to be close, to stop pretending that distance was still possible. When he touched me, it was tentative, almost reverent, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile. When I touched him back, I felt him exhale, like he'd been holding his breath for far too long. We moved slowly, guided more by trust than desire. Every gesture asked permission. Every pause was respected. It wasn't about bodies fitting together. It was about allowing ourselves to be seen without armor. Afterward, we lay there in silence, the kind that settles after truth has been spoken. Jack didn't rush to get dressed, didn't check the time, didn't retreat into himself like men sometimes do when reality starts knocking. He stayed present, fingers tracing patterns on the back of my hand, as if memorizing something he didn't want to forget. That's when I started to notice the changes. He talked less about home. He stayed longer with me. He hesitated before returning to his old routines. At first, I thought it was guilt. Then I realized it was distance. Not from me, but from the life he'd been living before I entered it. He stopped pretending things were fine. He stopped making excuses for silence, for disconnection, for the emptiness he'd normalized for years. Being with me didn't create the problem, it revealed it. And that's when the truth finally settled in. I hadn't trapped him. I hadn't charmed him into confusion or manipulated his emotions the way I'd done so easily in the past. This wasn't a game I controlled. This wasn't a habit repeating itself. He had looked at his life, felt the cost of staying the same, and still chosen me, knowing exactly what it might cost him. That realization shook me more than any confession could have, because it meant responsibility. It meant this wasn't something I could walk away from without consequences. It meant I wasn't just passing through anymore. Love like this wasn't supposed to exist. It was inconvenient, complicated, risky. And yet, there we were, standing in the middle of it, no longer pretending it was temporary, no longer pretending we were untouched. For the first time, I wasn't the one in control. And for the first time, that didn't feel like weakness. Felt like truth. Couldn't stay hidden forever. I felt it before Jack ever said the words. The tension in his voice, the way his messages grew shorter, heavier. Something had shifted on his side of the world. And this time, it wasn't quiet. He came to see me one evening without warning. No smile. No easy calm. His shoulders looked heavier, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down. "She knows," he said simply. The words landed without drama. No explanation. No anger. Just fact. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. People like her, sharp, observant, unwilling to look away, always know before there's proof. She'd been watching the space between us from the beginning. She'd just waited for it to make sense. She asked me directly, he continued. Didn't accuse, didn't shout, just asked. That hurt more than anger ever could. There had been tears. He told me that later. Not loud ones. Quiet ones that came with disappointment rather than rage. The kind that don't ask to be comforted because they already know the answer. She gave him an ultimatum. End it, or end the marriage. No negotiations. No delays. No space to pretend this was confusion or a phase. She wanted truth even if it destroyed what they had built together. I listened without interrupting, already feeling myself retreat. This was the part one knew how to handle. The part where things got real, and I slipped away before becoming the villain in someone else's story. I understand, I said quietly. You don't owe me anything. I meant it. I started making plans in my head, practical ones. Moving timelines, new places. The familiar comfort of escape settled in, almost soothing. This was my pattern. Leave before I'm chosen against something that matters. Jack didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but something hard had settled into it. I'm not losing you, he said. I looked at him, startled. Jack! No! He interrupted gently. Let me finish. He took a breath, like someone stepping into cold water. For years, I chose comfort because it was easier than asking myself what I wanted. I thought stability was the same thing as happiness. It isn't. I could hear the weight in his words, the nights of silence, the distance he'd learned to live with, the parts of himself he'd folded away to keep everything intact. Lying to her would be easier, he said. Pretending this didn't happen would be easier. Going back to what I know would be easier. He met my eyes. But it wouldn't be true. The room felt unbearably still. I told her the truth, he continued. All of it. Who I am. What I feel. What I can't ignore anymore. My chest tightened. And she deserves someone who doesn't live halfway, he said softly. So do I. I realized then that he wasn't choosing me instead of her. He was choosing honesty instead of survival. I'd prepared myself to disappear, to be the secret that got buried, the mistake that got erased. I'd already started detaching, already bracing for the familiar ache of walking away. But he wouldn't let me. He reached for my hand. Not desperately, not urgently, just present, certain. I don't know what comes next, he said. I just know I'm done pretending. For the first time, someone didn't ask me to be smaller to make their life easier. They chose truth. They chose me. And standing there, with no escape left to hide behind, I realized I was more terrified than I'd ever been. Because this time, leaving wasn't an option. And neither was pretending I didn't care. Jack didn't hesitate. Once the choice was made, he moved with a clarity that both amazed and unsettled me. He didn't linger in doubt or soften the truth to make it easier. He left his marriage with honesty, not cruelty, but with finality. There were conversations I wasn't part of, decisions made in quiet rooms I would never see. When he came back to me afterward, there was grief in his eyes, but no regret. He began rearranging his life like someone clearing space for something essential. Schedules shifted. Habits changed. He spoke about the future openly now, without hesitation, without that careful distance he used to keep. And somewhere in those conversations, I realized I had stopped being a part of his life and become the center of it. He talked about moving closer to me, about plans that reached months ahead, then years, about building something solid, something intentional. His certainty was steady, unwavering, too steady, too fast. I found myself struggling to keep up. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. I'd spent years perfecting the art of escape, of keeping one foot out the door. I knew how to be wanted. I didn't know how to be needed like this. There were moments when his devotion felt heavy in my hands, like something fragile I might drop if I wasn't careful. He looked at me as if I were the answer to questions he'd been asking his whole life. And that scared me. I caught myself pulling back in small ways, changing the subject when he talked too far ahead, pausing before responding to messages filled with hope, measuring my words, afraid of promising more than I knew how to give. He noticed. You don't have to carry everything, he said once, his voice gentle, not accusing. I'm not asking you to save me. But the truth was, he didn't need to ask. I feared I was becoming the thing I'd always run from, the single point around which someone else's world revolved. I'd seen what that kind of devotion could turn into. Expectations, pressure, a weight disguised as love. I didn't want to be worshipped. I wanted to be chosen, but not at the cost of someone losing themselves. Late one night, lying beside him, listening to the quiet certainty of his breathing, I realized how far the balance had shifted. He had given everything he knew how to give. Now it was my turn to decide whether I could stay, not out of fear, not out of habit, but with the same honesty he had shown me. And that choice felt heavier than any suitcase I'd ever packed to leave. I stood at the edge of a familiar instinct. The urge to run didn't come loudly. It never did. It whispered. It reminded me how easy it would be to pack up, thank him for everything, and leave before love turned into damage. I'd done it before. Left behind half-finished stories and people who wanted more than I could give. Staying felt riskier than leaving. If I stayed, I couldn't hide behind charm or distance anymore. I'd have to show up fully, not as the version of myself that controlled outcomes, but as the one who could be hurt too. I watched Jack as he slept. His face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in anyone before. He wasn't holding on. He wasn't demanding. He was simply there, open, trusting, real. That was when I understood something essential. Running wouldn't protect him. It would only protect my fear. So I stayed. Not as someone to be depended on blindly, not as the center of his world, but as an equal, someone who would choose him every day, not because he gave everything, but because we met each other in the middle. I told him the truth the next morning, about my past, about my habits, about the way I used to mistake control for safety. I didn't soften it. I didn't decorate it. He listened. Then he nodded and said, "We'll figure it out together. No promises, no urgency, just intention." For the first time, love didn't feel like a trap closing in around me. It felt like a door I could walk through at my own pace. Fear had been the cage all along, and choosing him, choosing us, was the bravest thing I'd ever done.